last Friday, Clerk released the Core 2.0, which is now in general availability. We're going to review what has changed in the SDK specifically for Next.js if you want to implement or start a new application with Clerk as the authentication. But we're going to also look at it from the perspective of what has changed if you're coming from the previous versions. So we're going to review the notes, and then we're going to build an application together that implements server-side components or pages, client-side components and pages, accessing the user data, protecting the pages, the middleware specifically, which is what has changed the most in Clerk. And then we're going to create a template for our Next.js applications that we can then clone for any project to be the starting point. Our template would be with Next.js, Tailwind, CSS, TypeScript, Chat.cn, and also Clerk as the authentication. So let's first look at what has changed in the Core 2.0 release. I'm going to get into this more detailed version. Now we have refreshed UI component. If you know and have used Clerk before, you know it comes built in with drop-in components that you can use in your app, whether it would be control components for authentication and for protection, or UI components like user buttons, user profiles, and whatnot. And they have gone through a major change in the Core 2.0 release. Now, as always, like before, if you still wanted to customize your UI or this drop-in component, you can do so by passing in an appearance prop, or use the hooks. Instead of using the UI components, you can just use the hooks and implement the same functionality. But in the appearance prop, or the way that you pass in the information, this has also changed a bit. So I'm going to just review this from a high level so you know what options you have available if you are thinking of changing, or if you don't like the appearance, or you've wanted to customize it to your app, you know what's available to you. Now, the easiest way to update or customize these UI components is to use one of the pre-built themes that Clerk actually provides. So let's go here. You can see there's different themes here. There's the default theme. Well, this is not quite how it looks now because this is still, I believe, the previous version. We're going to see this in live on our site in a second. There is a dark version. So if your site has a dark and light theme, you can just use this version or switch these themes. There is the shade of purples and also the new brutalism version, so you can use the themes. Now, above and beyond these themes, you can customize each one of these themes using CSS variables. So there is a link and a guide here so that you know how you can use a specific theme either for all of the UI components. So when you're wrapping your components with the Clerk provider, you can just pass in an appearance. We're going to see this in action again. If you're new to Clerk, bear with me. I'm just talking about how you can customize the look of it and how this might be a bit different from the way that we used to use the appearance prop in the previous versions of Clerk. But you can also pass in variables or define specific variables or change using variables. So down here, for example, we're using a base theme, but we're also passing in some variable. For example, we're changing the color primary to be red on all of the components, but specifically on the sign-in page, we're changing it to be blue, for example. So read through this if you want to customize. That's something that has slightly changed from the past. And it is going to be something that if you're using the drop-in components from Clerk, what I have found in my applications is that that is not going to match the design of my apps. So I need to customize it, and I need to get into these variables or different themes, or I have to build my own UI components from scratch or something to know that it exists. And with the themes, it's actually easier to customize these UIs. Now, the biggest change, in my opinion, for Next.js SDK is the middleware. Now, the way that we used to protect all of the routes in Next.js using Clerk was to have this middleware file, which is going to run the auth middleware or the Clerk middleware. The naming has become Clerk middleware in the new version. And the way that's different from the past is that in the past, when you have the middleware and when you were exporting the auth middleware from Clerk, it would by default protect all the routes. And if you wanted to exclude any route, you had to specifically exclude those routes. Whereas now, when you run the middleware, it's not going to protect any of the routes. So the default has changed to make all the routes public. And if you want to protect, which we're going to see in the code, you have to then specify which routes you want to protect. There's also more helper functions from the middleware exported or imported that you can now use. We're going to see a couple of them here and also in the code. For example, we have this create route matcher. This is to create routes that you want to be protected. So it returns a function that you can call and pass in the request object. It tells you if the user is trying to access one of these protected routes. And if so, we're going to then call the auth function. And then this auth function is what's passed to our middleware. And then the protect function on it, which is going to protect this path. And if they're not authenticated, it's going to redirect them to the sign-in page. Now, there's more that you can do here, or you can basically check the auth and decide what you wanted to do if you wanted to have more granular access. Again, in the docs, there's more details about different ways that we can write up the logic inside of our middleware. We're going to see that as well. But basically, the main difference is that now, by default, none of or all of the paths are public. Nothing is protected unless you create this matcher and write the logic to protect a specific path. Everything would be public. Now, if you have used Clerk before in the past, sometimes you would have seen this white flash when you wanted to check the session on the client side. Before it loads the session, they have completely gotten rid of that the flash or the white flash for checking the session. Now, checking the session on the client side doesn't require JavaScript, which is called a handshake internally, and it's a better user experience, and it seems to be faster and snappier. And the rest is house cleaning, so removing redundant or deprecated codes from the past. Sometimes the polyfills that they had to provide to actually support different runtimes. Now, if you wanted to run the Core 2, you have to at least have Node version 18.7 and React 18 and Next.js 13.0.4. And this has allowed them to remove some of the code that was just to support the previous versions. So it has made the package to be smaller and also the production build to be significantly smaller than before. There's also this CLI tool, which you can help to upgrade. It is going to scan your code, recognizing what version you're using, and then giving you steps in the terminal to what you need to do to upgrade to the next version. So this was a high-level overview of the new release and what has changed. In the next step, we're going to build a brand new Next.js application and implement Clerk as the authentication using this new version. To see this step by step, we're going to then turn that project into a template that we can use as the starting point for our future projects. It's going to be Next.js, Tailwind CSS, ShadCN, and Clerk for the authentication. So if you haven't already, you can create an account on Clerk for free. There's no credit card needed. And the free account or the free tier has been upgraded to now include up to 10,000 monthly active users and also 100 organizations if you're using a multi-tenant structure. So definitely create an account to test this out. And once you create an account, you will be redirected back to this page where you can create a new application. So I'm going to also create a new application. Let's call this Clerk Core 2. And then we're going to have email and Google as the social login. You can change these settings later on. Once you create your application, it's going to redirect you back to your homepage where you can have access to users, settings for your organizations, and the authentication methods that we just saw. You can enable and disable any of these providers, require usernames, phone numbers, and whatnot. We're not going to talk about this. It's pretty self-explanatory. if you just review this different providers that they have here. Now, some of these, like the multi-factor authentication, would only work if you are on the pro account. For example, the SMS or phone number is only for pro accounts, so you can test it in the development environment, but if you wanted to use it in production, you have to upgrade to the pro account. But most of the stuff that we use, such as email, password, usernames, and social logins, can be used in the free tier. Now, if I go back to the home page where we started, you can see that there is a high-level overview of how you would go about implementing this in Next.js, or you can select in different environments such as React, Remix, or your backend, even Expo, which is React Native, or Node.js Express. But we're going to continue from the docs. So let's go to our Clerk, and then let's access the docs from here. So we have this quick start guides. If I make this a bit smaller, you can see there's this quick starts, which you can select based on the framework that you're using, or you can go to this guides if you want a specific implementation. For example, we have onboarding, we have role-based authentication and whatnot. There's useful guides over here too. So we're going to go to quick start, click on Next.js, and this is going to help us implement this in Next.js. Hopefully this is big enough for you guys to see. So we're going to use the app router. We're going to install Clerk Next.js as the first step. But before we do that, let's actually build or create a brand new Next.js application. I'm going to use this Next.js template that we have, so we can use this template. I'm going to include a link in the description so you can use this one too. So Clerk Core, let's also call this Clerk Core 2, create a repository. Once this repository is created, you can then clone this version into your local machine and start working on it. This is Next.js, TypeScript, Helm CSS, and ChatCN already built in. So let me clone this, bring it to my local development area, and then I'm going to git clone, and then I'm going to select the current directory because I'm already in the next Clerk. So let's pm and see what's going on inside our application from a high level. My pm is out of date, so let's update the pm as well. Why not? Okay, let's pm dev. Let me from a high level show what's happening here before we do anything. So this is a Next.js application that's using TypeScript, Helm CSS, and ChatCN already built in. So let's look at the layout. We have the theme provider. We also, by the way, has a theme provider using the Next themes. So let me just open this up as well so we can see what's going on at the same time. So we have this pretty header up top, and we have this theme toggle button that changes this to light and dark. This is using Next themes with this themes provider, a header, a footer. Pretty simple, but it's already built or it's configured with ChatCN. So you can see inside the components, I have some basic components like the button and also the drop-down menu, which we're using with this theme toggle switch, the footer, the header, and then the theme provider, which is what we use to wrap our whole application with. Just to dive in here, this is using Next themes package, as I mentioned, to provide this theme to our application. Quick side note, you can wrap your pages with a theme provider, which is a client component because we want to use React context. This is what Next themes is doing. And this is not going to turn your entire app into a client component or client pages, because you can pass server components into client components as children or as props, and children is a specific type of prop without changing or without affecting it being a server component. Just a side note that I get a lot in the comments, so I thought I'll explain that. So that's as far as it's happening in our app. In the page, we just have this little H1 that says Next.js starter. Okay, so let's go back to our guide. The first step is for us to add the Clerk Next.js SDK. So let's open up the terminal and copy the code to add Clerk. Okay, so pm dev again. I'm going to close this off. Now the next step is to copy your environment variables. Now when you're logged in, when you visit the docs, it is actually your variables here. So if you can see up top here, I made it a bit smaller so we can see these drop downs. It is picking a specific project, so I can go to our Clerk Core 2 project. and this is the development version of our app. This is provided by Clerk, but when you want it to deploy to production, you have to create your own instances of whatever social login you're using to then use your own credentials instead of using these shared credentials from Clerk. For example, we're using Google login, but we haven't set up a Google authentication app. We're just using the shared version of Clerk. So it makes it very easy for us to iterate and to develop. But once we want to deploy to production, we have to then bring in our own instance and our own API keys and secret keys from Google or any other social platform that we're using. But what I wanted to say is that you have this already pre-populated with your own credentials. If you go back to your dashboard, you can also see these credentials here as well. You can also go down here to API keys and you would see your publishable key and the secret key here as well. So let's go to the docs. Let's make this big again. Let's copy this. Let's go back to our application. We're going to create a .env file. So .env.local. You can also name it .env, but if you did, go to your git ignore and make sure that the .env is also ignored because it's not by default. And if you don't, you're going to end up committing your credentials to your repository. So let's close this off. That was the second step. Third step is to wrap our entire app with the Clerk provider. So let's do this. We're going to bring in this, go to our layout, maybe up there. I'm going to bring in Clerk. And then down here, what I'm going to do is to wrap my entire application with the Clerk provider. There you go. Now, oftentimes, when you are wrapping your entire app with something like this that provides context, the user and the session data to your app, you would need to create your own wrapper just as we did for the theme provider. So we had to bring in the next themes and then wrap it inside of our own use client or client component like we did here to then be able to wrap it inside of our app. Now, for Clerk, you don't need to do that because they've already done, they already have that use client directive up top inside of this component. So all you need to do is just bring it inside your root layout, wrap your entire app with it, and you're done. Now, the fourth step is to actually create your middleware. This is what's actually needed to protect your pages and run authentication on your routes. So let's create a middleware.ts file in the root of our application. And for now, let's just copy this basic version of our middleware and see what this is. So this is one of the changes in the Core 2.0 where we don't have the auth middleware. Instead, we have the Clerk middleware. And the difference, as I mentioned in the beginning, is that now it doesn't protect any route by default. So all of our routes are now public. What this does is that it runs the authentication middleware, so it manages the session and on all the routes, but it doesn't protect any route unless we tell it so, which we're going to see in a second. There's this reference for the new Clerk middleware, which we're going to see in action. But let's continue and add some UI components to our header so we can give the user a way to sign in and create custom sign in and sign up pages and a user button or a user profile once they signed in. So the next step is to actually do that. Now, as I mentioned, or as you may have already been familiar, Clerk comes in with some drop-in components such as the sign in button, the user button, and some control components like the signed out and the signed in. This is to conditionally render different components or different contents depending on the auth state. So what we want to do is to bring in this component into our header. So inside of our header right now, all we have is just this link that goes to home and this theme toggle button. So let's wrap this with a div of flex. Let's bring this down and also copy the code we brought in here. Let's also import this component from Clerk, and I'm going to explain what we're doing here. We don't need the Clerk provider here. So we are bringing in this signed in and signed out. As you can see, when I'm signed out, these are control components and say, hey, if the user is signed out, show a sign in button. If the user is signed in, show a user button. Okay. And let's go back to our app and we should be able to see this. Let's save this up, go to our app and refresh. Okay, we see the sign in button there. So let's give this items center and justify center. Let's also give a gap of 6 so they're nice and wide. Now something we can do here is this sign in button just shows a button, but if you want, you can actually pass in your own component. So let's bring in our chat.cn button so we can have a more consistent look in our app to render the button in the way that we want. So that's the sign in button. So our app is now ready to go. If we click on the sign in page, because we haven't created a sign in page, it's going to redirect us back to a hosted sign in page from Clerk. But we can also implement our own sign in page, and that's what we're going to do next. Going back to the documentation, we are done implementing Clerk in our app. Next step, if you want, you can create your custom sign in and sign up page, and that's what we're going to do. But you can also use the hosted version. So let's actually go ahead and do this. We're going to have to create 2 pages, one for sign in and one for sign up. So I'm going to create one for sign up dash. It's going to be a optional catch all route. So sign up, and then let's close the brackets, and then we're going to have a page.tsx here. Now let's copy this code. This is for the sign up. Let's close this up. So it's a page. Let's actually bring here a section.py24 and a div to center this. Maybe also flex items center, justify center, and let's bring in this sign up here. Okay, let's get rid of this semicolon, bring this up and save. So this sign up component comes from Clerk. So you can just bring it into any page that you want. I'm just wrapping it with some sections and containers to make it center. And now we're going to have our own sign up page. We can do the same thing for the sign in page. Just to show you the routing structure, you have the sign up, and then you have an optional catch-all route inside of it, and then we had the page. This is to catch everything that comes after this sign up as well with this same page, and that's what the optional catch-all, it just matches all the other segments. I do have a video on the channel where we talk about catch-all routes and optional catch-all routes. I'm going to include the link in the description if you want to learn more about that. So this is the sign up. Now let's create one for sign in. And now for creating these folders, all with the files inside, I'm just creating a new file. But once you create a file and put the slashes in, VS Code is just going to automatically turn them into folders. So I'm going to say sign in this time, and then slash. Then I'm going to have the catch-all routes. I'm going to have sign in, close the brackets, / and then page.tsx. This is going to create the folders automatically and the file inside of it. Nice trick if you wanted to create the folders and files in one go. So this is the sign in page. Let's actually copy this one and then bring it here. We change this to sign in, and then this needs to be sign in. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that you can see both of these components have this path set to it. Now, to these components, you have to pass in where they are mounted on our application. So we are saying to Clerk that this is mounted on sign in, and this is mounted on / sign up. Now, to avoid this, you can pass in, or you can set some environment variables, which is Clerk sign in URL and sign up URL. So therefore, you don't need to pass this path prop to your sign in and sign up. So let's close this up, go to env, and also copy these two. So I'm saying the sign in URL is at / sign in. The sign up URL is at / sign up. And with that out of the way, I don't need to provide this props to these two components. So I can just close this off and remove them. Let's close everything here, go back to our app. And now we should have our own sign in and sign up page. Now, if I click this sign in here, it's going to redirect to my own sign in page. So / sign in. it automatically also sets the redirect URL so that it takes me back to where I started after I log in. So let me go ahead and log in. Okay, so now I'm logged in. As you can see, I have the user button up there. This is rendered again from Clerk. This is this component that we were using here. So if you're signed in, now this control component is going to kick in, and it's using the user, or it's showing the user button component, which is this button, opens up this menu where you can access, we can sign out, or you can access your account, the security and the profile. You can just update your profile, add email addresses and whatnot, which is all built in from Clerk. Okay, so let's recap what we have done so far. We've installed the Clerk NextJs SDK. We have included our environment variables to associate our Clerk instance with the account that we have created. We added the middleware file to run this logic and authentication on every single request. For now, we're not protecting any route. We're just running the auth on all the pages, but all the pages are public as of now. We're going to go into how we're going to update or protect a specific route in a second. As the next step, we also implemented this user button and sign in button inside of our header, and we created custom sign in and sign up page. So it has a similar look and feel to our app instead of redirecting the users to the Clerk hosted version of sign in and sign up page. So there's two more things that I want to do. One is to dive a bit deeper into the authentication middleware and what has changed in the Core 2.0. But I want to also show you how you would access the user data, the session data inside of a server render page or a server component versus client side. So on the server side, for example, in your server components or in your server actions or inside a route handler or API route, and also on the client side. So we're going to do both of those. So let's go back to the docs and have a look at the new Clerk middleware. As we have already seen, the basic use is just to import it and call this function. This is going to run the middleware on all the routes, but by default, it's not going to protect any of the routes. So how do we go about now protecting our routes? So we have this new create route matcher function that we can pass in the same stuff that we would have passed to our config matcher. If you are familiar with middlewares in Next.js, and if you're not, there's a video on the channel. I'm going to link it in the description. You can export this config from your middleware, which tells Next.js for what paths this middleware should run. Right now, inside of this matcher, we're running it on all of our routes. So you can use the same type of syntax to explain the segments and the routes that you want to be protected and pass them to this create route matcher. It can take an array of different routes. For example, here it says anything that includes /dashboard and anything that comes after it should be protected, or forum in this case. So we can use something very similar to this. Now we have that matcher like so. How do we go about protecting it? Well, we can come inside of our Clerk middleware function and check to see if the user is trying to access a protected route, and if so, we're going to use this auth function and call the protected on it. So let's actually implement or replace this with our middleware. So let's go back to our application, to our middleware, and we're going to change this to reflect our own app. So instead of having to protect the forum, we don't have a forum page and a dashboard. Maybe we will call this protected, and then we're going to create these pages. So any page that is /protected and anything after it is going to be our protected routes. And inside of our middleware, I'm saying if by passing this request to this function, I'm saying if the user is trying to access a protected route, we'll call the auth function. This is going to expose another function that's called protect. And this is going to redirect them to sign in if they're not already logged in. And if the route is not one of our protected, well, the Clerk middleware doesn't do anything. It just calls the next response and hands off the torch to the next function, if there is any, or send a response back to our application. So now let's go back to our application and try to access. Let's log out. And with this setting, let's now try to access protected path. Now, as you can see, I'm redirected back to the sign-in page, but also in the redirect URL, I can see that the protected path is where I was trying to access. Now, I do not have a protected path. So while we're here, why don't we just go ahead and create these protected paths? So I'm going to have a protected folder. Inside of it, I'm going to create a folder, which is a server component, and also another folder, which is a client component. Let's put a page.tsx in both. So a function component. We close this off. It's going to be a page. And let's just wrap the good old section with py24 and a div of container, h1 text 3xl and font bold, saying this is a client protected client side page. Let's just get rid of this React import and actually pass this use client directive. So this is a client component, and I'm going to do something very similar to this server component. So let's bring in a page.tsx here, copy this. We're going to remove the use client directive and say this is a server side. Okay, we're going to protect these pages, or they're already protected because they're all inside of this protected. So they come in /protected /server /protected /client. They're already protected, but we're going to access the user data and the session data inside of them using different functions and hooks from Clerk in the next step. So I just created them here. Now let's actually go back to our homepage and refresh our app. Why don't we actually go inside of our header component and add more links so we can have one that goes to /protected and /server. Let's call this server, and then we're going to go to protected /client. So this is going to be the client version of our protected page. That is going to show up there. I just realized that I have a typo here, so let's rename this. It's not page with two A's. It's just page.tsx. Now with this, if I try to access the server, it's going to redirect me to the sign-in page, and it has captured the redirect URL to be /protected /server. So let's go ahead and sign in now. And I'm now back to the protected server page. So because I'm signed in, I can access this. Now here comes the next step of actually accessing the user data over here. So let's go back to the docs on the bottom of the same page that we used to create custom sign-in and sign-up pages. There's another guide that walks you through accessing the user session on the client and also on the server. So for the server side, inside the app router, you have two functions you can use. One is the auth function that gives you the current auth state and the user ID. And one gives you the current user. It gives you the current user. If you want more information about the user, such as their first name, last name, and whatnot, you could use this function. If you just merely want to check whether or not they're signed in, you can just use the auth function. And there's examples of how you would use this inside of a server component like so, or inside a route handler. We're going to also implement this together. And also this handler with user fetch, where you wanted to access the specific user's information. Okay, so let's go back here. What we're going to do is to use the auth function to get the user ID or the current user. Let's use the current user. So inside of our server component, what we can do, we can go const user equals to await current user, if I can type. And now I need to turn this function into an async function. I can do so because this is a server component. And now down here, what I can do is to just pass in a paragraph. Why not? There is no first name. I think there is first name in Clerk. Not sure. And the user might be null. Well, we know it's not going to be null because this page is protected from our middleware. But anyways, let's just see what this says. Let's go back to our page. And it says, welcome, Hamed. If you can see, might be a bit small. So now I have access to the current user. Now let's see how we can do the same thing on client side. And we're going to also do the same thing in a route handler in a second, but let's just go to the client side. This middleware, by the way, also works on the pages router. If for whatever reason you're still using the pages router, you could use the same middleware there too. But scrolling down, you can get to the get or the client side. There's two hooks. Use auth, similar to the auth function, gives you access to the current auth state, and the use user, which is going to give you access to the current user. So let's copy this part inside of our client component. I can access this hook, and this is going to give me the current user. Let's just bring in the same paragraph that we have here inside of this, and we're going to say user.firstname. Okay, so let's go back to our app, refresh. Now if I go to the client protected page, you can see this is a client side page and I'm accessing the user information. Okay, great. So just to show you, it would be similar if we were to also check the user information inside of an API route or a server action with the same functions. So let's actually create an API folder. Inside of it, I'm going to create another folder called me. And then inside of it, I'm going to put in a route.ts. And now I'm exporting a get function. This is how route handlers work in Next.js. Again, there is a video on the channel. I'm going to link it in the description. Learning about route handlers, which is API endpoints in Next.js or inside the app router. You have to export named functions like you see here. And now I'm accessing the same auth function. This is good anywhere on the server side. So if you're in the route handler, server actions, server components, you can use this. I'm getting this time the user ID. I'm not accessing the current user. I could have if I wanted to. And I'm passing in the user ID. Okay, let's go back to our header. And why not making this even nicer? I'm going to include yet another link to say go to API and go to me. And then here, I'm going to say who am I? Let's save this. Now, if I try to access the who am I, it's going to send a JSON response with my user ID. And just so we see, if I sign out and try to access the same route, it tells me I'm unauthorized because that's what we have said here. If there is no user ID, which means they're not authenticated, we're going to pass this unauthorized text response. And this is how to access user data inside of your server components or in a client component. Now, before we wrap up, I want to go back to the middleware and actually see more of what's happening here. So we learned how to protect specific routes using this create route matcher. You can pass in strings, you can pass in regular expressions to match different segments. And then using this new auth function and the protected on it, you can decide what happens over here. Now, as I mentioned, this is going to redirect the user back to the sign-in page by default. If you wanted to do any other logic in between the time that you check this and actually redirect them, you can. This auth also provides another function, which is redirect to sign-in. We can see down in the bottom the same documentation. So you can use that function instead. But the good thing is that this protect function also gives you access if you were to check the authorization status. So if, for example, I wanted to see if the user has a specific role. So here I'm checking the permissions to see if the user is actually a system manager or a domain manager. And not only this page is protected, but also it's protected against the user's specific roles and permissions. There's more use cases. For example, I can have two different logic here. One is for a tenant route where they're trying to access an organization, and one is for an admin route. And I have different logic here. So if it is an admin route, not only I want to protect those pages, but I want them to be an admin. But if it is just a regular tenant route, I just want to protect them without accessing or checking their authorization or permissions. You can also pass in a debug through to your middleware to debug. And another nice thing about the new middleware is how easily you can integrate it or combine it with other middlewares. For example, if you're using the Next Intel package for internationalization, The way to combine these two together is that once you have created your Intel middleware, you can just return that middleware from inside your Clerk middleware. Now, if you want to learn about more advanced stuff like the middleware, I am actually working on a course so you can access it through my site. I'm going to include a link in the description. Head to the courses section. I'm working on this Clerk course where we're going to cover topics like deploying to production, but also more advanced stuff like the middleware, using it or combining it with the internationalization middleware. We're going to talk about the webhook, which is a way for you to sync your Clerk data with your own database, because oftentimes when using a hosted provider like Clerk, you might worry that you don't have access to your user data, but you don't have to worry about that, because with the webhooks, you can just sync all of your data to your own database, so you always have your user data. We're going to cover things like extending the user object. So if you want to incorporate other stuff into your user object, for example, you are providing subscriptions and you want to have Stripe IDs or subscription IDs also accessible in the user object. We're going to talk about the metadata that allows you to extend the user object. We also main part is also talking about authorization or roles and permissions, and also organizations, which is a native feature in Clerk for you to provide this multi-tenancy application to other users where they can have their own organizations. They can invite different team members or different users with different permissions and roles. So if you're interested in that, head out to the link, just sign up. It's not published yet, but I will notify you when it's published if this is something that you're interested in. So that was a wrap for implementing the new Core 2.0 version of Clerk in Next.js. Links in the description to all the code that we have together and to the Clerk documentation. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.